Thank you for having me here today. I know I'm speaking to a room full of designers and architects, but I'd like to start by making maybe the bold statement, but I think it's arguable that the human brain is the most remarkable structure that we are aware of in the universe. It is an incredibly rapid parallel processor, enabling us to interpret information in our environment, complex stimuli, within a tenth of a second. It can store 1 billion bits of information over the course of our lives. That's 50,000 times the text in the Library of Congress. Also, despite living in a rather small space, the brain is a massive structure. There are 100 billion neurons, this is an estimate in the brain, which is sort of roughly on the order of the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. But more so, not just the number of neurons, there are hundreds of trillions of connections between these neurons, creating a distributed neural network of truly staggering complexity. But I don't have to tell you a lot of brain facts for you to be aware of how amazing our brains are. You live it every moment. Every emotion you feel, every thought you have, every sensation you experience, every move you make, your very sense of identity emerges from the functioning of our brains. Despite that, there are some very real limitations in the domains of attention, working memory, speed, and interference. And I'm going to just walk through these quickly for you. Attentional limitations. We know based on our experience that we cannot distribute and send our attention everywhere at the same time. We have to focus our resources on whatever is in the direction of our goals. So a very classic example, this is known as the cocktail party effect. You might be facing someone at a party, maybe you're not terribly interested in the conversation, and instead of maybe being so rude and walk away, you can direct what you see and what you hear to other places in the room without even moving away. So we're aware of this spotlight that we can switch around based on our goals. But yet the fact that we have to selectively direct our attention is in a sense a limitation, that we can't take in every bit of information equally at the same time. Speed limitations. The brain is an incredibly fast processor. Each neuron works on the order of milliseconds. However, the brain is a large distributed network, and many areas communicate with each other across in the brain at large distances. So when you're dealing with complex processes, there are actually speed limitations of the brain functioning as a network. Working memory limitations. Working memory is online memory. It's your ability to hold information in mind for brief periods of time to use to accomplish your goals. So a really classic example is a phone number, right? You're given a phone number, you just want to sort of hold it in mind long enough to get it into the phone. You have a very small likelihood of remembering in the long term. This ability is very limited, online memory. It's 7 for digits, like a phone number, but it decreases as complexity increases. So only 6 for letters, 5 for words, 3 or 4 for objects, 2 or even 1 for something as complex as a face, what you can literally hold in mind at any given moment. These type of limitations come together and give us a sensitivity to interference, both internally generated interference and externally generated interference. This is what a lot of the research in my lab is focused on, and we've really tried to create a new conceptual framework for thinking about interference. One thing we've done is separate interference into 2 different categories. One we call distractions. This is information that is irrelevant to your goals, and your intention is to ignore it. So you're at a restaurant, you're having a conversation, you would like to remember some details of this conversation, so what you do is try to block out all the chatter around you. You try to suppress that irrelevant information so you could focus on your goals. The other type of interference we call interruptions, or multitasking. This is when you actually attempt to do more than one thing at a time. So you're driving along, your cell phone goes off, you answer the call, and now you're both navigating traffic as well as having a conversation, trying to take in that interference because that's what your goals are. And this has been very helpful in studying these 2 different types of interference. But our sensitivity, and I'm going to talk about this a lot more coming up, our sensitivity to a negative impact by this interference is truly another limitation of our brain. So what happens when we take all the limitations we described and expose it to this? Right? So the last 10 years has really witnessed an explosion in technological innovation in media and the devices that distribute media, really changing the landscape of how we interact with technology. But what's probably even more salient is that there has been a shift in how we use our media. in that there's a lot of data coming out that we now use our media at the same time. We multitask. Here's an example of myself, I'm not immune to this by any means, working on 2 large monitors. The iTunes is going, my email's on the left screen, the talk I'm working on is in front of me, a browser's open, iPhone in hand. We tend to use our media in a very different way, largely because of its accessibility. But more so than that is that there's a shift in expectations now that I think is quite salient. We have constant access to communications, computer, and data, and this has really changed expectations, such that now immediate responsiveness and continued productivity is really expected. Many of you have been on vacation, and you know what it's like knowing that you have your cell phone there, that you get your emails, that you get texts, your employees know this. It has become almost impossible to really disconnect from the stream of information that our brain is exposed to, and clearly has impacts on how we function. So we might ask, given the limitations of our brain, the change in technology, the change in how we interface with technology, and change in expectations, how do we actually function at all? So this is through a process known as cognitive control. So what cognitive control is that how we perceive the world, our perception, is not a passive event. It just doesn't flood into our brains, but we control it based on attention. 2 types of attention. One type of attention is external, stimulus-driven attention. It is the world imposing itself upon how we perceive it. If there's a flash of light, a loud sound, even if someone calls your name quietly, anything that's very novel or very important demands your attention independent of your goals. This is known as bottom-up attention. The other type of attention is what you're doing now. Internal, goal-directed attention. You choose to focus what you're hearing and what you're seeing on what's in front of you, and that is influencing your perception. That is known as top-down, goal-directed attention. Your entire view of what goes on around you in your environment is really a balance of these 2 forces on how you perceive things. One thing we study a lot in our lab is how these influences on perception then go and shape your memory, both your long-term memory and your short-term memory. So what are the consequences of distraction and multitasking, the interference that exists around us, when it exceeds our top-down control, our ability to really dictate what information we are directing our attention at? I am going to tell you about one thing in particular, but I want to tell you that this field has grown massively recently. There is now quite a lot of information about an impact on safety, development, child development, education, social skills, work, and family. And if this talk was a lot longer, I'd go into each one of these things, because there's a lot of data really generated that this distraction and interference in general really has a very broad and deep impact on how we engage in the world. I'm going to tell you a little about its impact on cognition, because that's what we study. So I want to share with you a quote by Samuel Johnson, a British author from the 1700s, and it really touches on exactly what our research is trying to accomplish, or really insightfully speaks to it at a time before there was any research on this topic at all. And he says that the true art of memory is the art of attention, that no man will read with much advantage who is not able at pleasure to evacuate his mind. If the repositories of thought are already full, what can they receive? And if the mind is employed on the past or the future, the book will be held before the eyes in vain. Okay, let's move on to an experiment. So I think the easiest way, and I change this up as I give talks over the years about the experiment du jour of what we're looking at in our lab, and I think it's important for you to get a taste of what we study as opposed to me just telling you about it. So you're going to do a quick memory experiment. It's a very simple experiment. You have to remember a single face. It's going to come up very quickly. You're going to see the face. 7 seconds are going to pass. There's going to be an X on the screen. During that time, you're remembering the face, and then another face will come up. Your job would be to say, yes, that is a match. That's the face I saw, or no, that's a new face. Okay? All right, give it a shot. Okay, correct. If you did not get that correct, there's no reason to worry. Make a clinic appointment. I'm also a neurologist. It takes practice, and it was very quick. And not everyone gets them all right. I want to show you another experiment. This is exactly the same experiment. You're going to see a face. 7 seconds are going to pass, there's going to be another face, you have to match it. Except here, there's going to be a face that's going to come up in the middle. And what you have to do with that face is decide whether it's a man above or under 20 years old, and then go back to the memory test. Does that make sense? Okay, give it a shot. Is that the same face? Okay, it was. This is what the data looks like. It's hard to determine if that was harder or easier, but let me show you what happens. This is what the experiment looks like. So this is the top experiment, the one that you did first with no interference. A face comes up, you wait, a face appears. Here's the experiment you did second. A face comes up, an interrupting face, a multitasking. You're doing a secondary task comes up, you make the gender and age decision, and then you go back to your memory task. There's actually a third one called the distraction experiment. Here a face comes up in the middle that's entirely irrelevant to your goals. You're told that an irrelevant face is going to come up, just totally ignore it and go back to your task. And you do these in a block, so you know exactly which one you're engaged in. What we find is that younger adults, in green here, their memory performance drops with distraction. Here's their performance on the no interference. Here's distraction. And the last bar is with interruption. It's subtle, but it's very significant. That even just bringing up a face that's totally irrelevant in the middle of trying to remember a face decreases performance. Here's what we find in healthy 60 and 70-year-olds. Here's the memory without interference, with distraction, and now with interruption. So overall, working memory, this ability to hold information in time, just a single face, declines. But the impact of distraction is greater, and the impact of multitasking is even greater. We found this across dozen experiments in our lab. And we actually showed that the biggest impact on performance is not necessarily focus, but ignoring. Shutting out irrelevant information has a much more dramatic and consistent impact on high-level performance in both healthy younger adults and older individuals than does even focus. So it really places a strong emphasis on suppressing irrelevant information and dealing with interference. I was going to have you perform this experiment, but I'm just going to ask you to perform it later on. What I want you to do is ask someone, look them in the face, and ask them to tell you in some detail what they had for dinner the night before. What you're going to probably find is that they look away, and then they look back to you. And we hypothesize, and this is a very common reaction, that why this is because they're actually distracted by your face, and that's inhibiting their ability to do this memory test, which relies on visual imagery. So we did an experiment, this is just published a couple months ago in Journal of Neuroscience, where we showed participants this whole set of images, 168 images with different number of objects. So here are 3 crowns, there could be 4 vacuum cleaners. Over here, they're not Statue of Liberties, although they look like that, 4 couches. They don't know they have to remember them, they're asked questions about them. Can they carry them, and can they fit in this space? Then, after 1 hour, they do a memory test, where they hear the name of one of the objects, like crown, and they have to press a button on how many they remember seeing. Everyone reports that they go back and try to create the image. They say 1, 2, 3, or 4. Here, the correct answer are 3 crowns. But we do this with 3 different conditions. We do this with their eyes shut, with their eyes open looking at a gray screen, or their eyes open looking at a busy visual picture, sort of what you're looking at now. And what we find surprisingly, because this is a pretty basic experiment, could have been done anywhere in the field for a long time, but it appears that no one has done it, what we find, and maybe this is intuitive, but what we see is that your ability to recollect the details of that visual experience decreases in this last bar when your eyes open looking at a busy picture relative to your eyes open looking at a gray picture or your eyes shut. Your memory, the quality of your detailed memory declines just by looking at a normal scene around you. We then asked the question, well, what will happen if the distraction is not visual but auditory? So we did this exact experiment again, but instead of these manipulations, we had silence, white noise, like a shh, or restaurant chatter. Went into a busy cafe and taped the normal chatter that you hear around you. And what we find with auditory distraction is exactly the same thing. Still, this very selective impact of the auditory distraction on the detailed memory. So this is not a way for me to recommend that you walk around with blindfolds on and earplugs in. It's just to show you the exquisite sensitivity that our cognition has just to the normal amount of interference that exists around us. And imagine what you normally engage in your day in terms of interference. We use this not just to study that phenomena, but we use it to study the brain. We use several different techniques to study the brain. One is functional MRI, where you lay inside a scanner, we're recording blood flow changes in your brain that correlate with neural activity. It lets us see where events are occurring in the brain. And the other is EEG, electroencephalography. This allows us to see when events are occurring. It's an electrical measure and has very strong temporal locking for our recording to what's occurring in the brain. I'm just going to give you a very global picture of what myself, my lab, and colleagues, many people have converged on how distraction and multitasking really impact the brain. We think of the prefrontal cortex, this front part of the brain over here, as essentially the bouncer, determining what information is on the guest list. It decides what gets in. And through connections, this distributed network controls how much information is in the sensory areas. This is a visual part of the brain. I depict it here as a busy nightclub, but it's really probably just a very, very small dinner table of just 6 items that can get in. If something happens here, if this bouncer is not doing its job, you have a cost. And that cost is an impact on performance by letting information in that there's just not room for. When it comes to multitasking, it's very similar. Again, the prefrontal cortex plays a very important role. But here it acts something more as a flight controller, determining what's the priority for processing right now. So for instance, if you happen to be biking and texting in Manhattan at the same time, as apparently people do, you might have to make the decision to focus on traffic, or the prefrontal cortex might channel your processing to focusing on the text. One thing that we're pretty confident it does not do is this. Both things at the same time. This is because there's a bottleneck, often known as a central bottleneck. And this has really led to thinking of multitasking almost as a myth, that it's not really multitasking, but rapid task switching. Now, if things are very automated and rehearsed, like chewing gum and walking, sure, you could do them at the same time. But anything that's really demanding cognitive resources, especially if they compete in any way, really probably involves rapid switching rather than real simultaneous processing. When you do this, there's a cost, both due to the time delay of the switch, as well as the general performance cost of not continuing one event at a time. So why do we do it at all? So this is a complex question. There's actually not a ton of data on this. Most of this is really empirical, based on some of my own intuitions, a little bit of data. But multitasking has a lot of seemingly benefits. It seems to give us flexibility. We could decide what we think we're most capable of achieving the highest level of performance on at that time, and then switch to something else. It gives us a fresh perspective when we change. The feeling of increased variety, that our lives are somehow richer by doing more things. It enables us to use downtime more productively. A lot of people describe it as just being more fun. It's probably true that the amount of novelty that you experience over a given time of multitasking is greater than single tasking. And we are very responsive to novelty. It's part of our evolution. We are attracted to novelty. It allows us to explore the world. And it's probably related to the reward system, dopamine. Maybe even at the level of addiction, it's been questioned the type of stimulation that occurs by constantly seeking out new things. Why do we expose ourselves to distraction? Why do people go into busy coffee shops and open up a book to read or study when they could easily go into a library or just stay at the quietness of their home? This is still a largely open-ended question, but it appears that in some situations, distraction might act as a benefit, maybe allowing us to focus internally better. There's actually very little data on that. It's something that we're interested in looking into. What can be done about this? I would say with awareness comes possibility of change, and with that comes hope. That maybe now that we can understand how we interact with our environment in a way that's maybe detrimental to high-level performance, and I'm just talking about cognition, but I already described an impact on safety. As we know, texting and driving and family, everyone's sitting around the dinner table all engaged elsewhere other than each other. Maybe there's something we can do about this. So what can be done? It seems to me that there are 2 things we can do. We could change our behavior, or we could change our brains. That's sort of a scary picture. I didn't really, just thought it was an awesome picture. Didn't want it to really set what I think about that. But okay, changing a behavior. So we could set laws. We could say you can't text and drive. It's too dangerous. Can't do it. We'll arrest you. You get a ticket. Just not going to happen. The other thing we could do is we could make decisions based on our awareness. And that's what I've done. Since I've been researching this, I felt it would be incumbent upon me to try to use this information. So this is how I try to behave. When I'm doing an important task that demands a high quality, I give it single attention. Quit email, turn off my phone, shut the door. Do one thing that really needs to be done at a high level at a time. When things require low level, when they're not time sensitive, when they're boring, coupling them together is probably the only way that you can get through them. I do that. So I might set an entire multitasking period of the day, 3 hours, where I just jump between things because they don't really require that detail, and a little drop on performance is not going to translate into a detrimental effect. So this is just the way that I approach it, but there's lots of ways that you could potentially deal with this once you're aware of the consequences. We could change our brains. We can give medications. There are medications. Cognitive enhancers were the name of the medication that we now use to treat Alzheimer's disease, cholinesterase inhibitors. Or we could train the brain in a similar way that we might go into a gym to train our physical bodies. We are now doing experiments in our lab. We just had a publication that don't have time, I'm not going to tell you about the data, where we've shown that you can have incredible amount of gain in older adults doing these type of brain training exercises after only 10 hours, returning to levels that 20-year-olds are capable of. We now have a collaboration. This was with colleagues at LucasArts, helped us design a video game based on dealing with interference and training these abilities. And the question is, can we change the brain into a more interactive structure that allows us to deal with interference better? And how we do it, I'm not going to go into the details of this particular intervention, but I would like to talk to our video game designer friend here. But this is really a brain recording experiment. So what we do is we record brain activity and cognition beforehand. Our participants go home on laptops and do this exercise. And we record their performance over time, and then they come back in and we record brain activity in the lab. Another thing that we're looking at now is using a new cap, an EEG cap that people could take home with them. And while they play the game, it's recording their brain activity, sending it to the computer, and sending it right to our lab server. So we have the ability to record brain activity as it changes in time of people at home. And we can also record activity before and after using functional MRI. So this is how our lab is exploring how dynamic our brains are and how much they can develop if we expose it to the right type of intervention. So I'd just like to thank you for your attention and, of course, your lack of attention. My lab.